Sometimes, when an adoptee decides to look into the life of their first family, they're taken on an adventure they couldn't have anticipated. That was true for Ed Gangi. As he searched, he discovered not only an amazing story, but many helpful, kind people along the way. Find out more about Ed and his journey, this time on Adoption Uncovered. Well, hello and welcome. If you could just start out telling me who you are and how are you connected to adoption?
Yeah, Charlene, thank you so much. It's nice to be here with you. My name is Ed DeGangi. I'm now approaching my 76th birthday, and I was adopted at a day old back in 1948. So that makes me a true veteran of the baby scoop era, I think. My adoption was privately arranged, so it was not done through the social services system, but I discovered as I searched that my mother, who had become unexpectedly pregnant, working through a common friend, located a couple who had been looking to adopt a child. So my adoption was privately arranged in New York. Ultimately, it did have to get approved through the courts, and that was done 18 months later. That interim period, I was considered their foster child, which I imagine had to be a terrifying thing for my parents. It just didn't seem very permanent. But it's as it all worked out, it worked out just fine. And I had what essentially was an idyllic childhood. And I think that's very much tied to the fact that I went to my parents at a day old. They were the only parents I ever knew. I don't have any recollection whatsoever of them ever having sat me down and saying, "You are adopted." Shortly before my wife and I married, my mother told my wife that she was instructed by the doctor who delivered me to just hold your baby, tell him you're my beautiful baby, our beautiful adopted baby, and we love you. And if my mother was told to do that, I have no doubt but that she did it. She stopped it sometime before I ever recalled that happening. And after that, I don't have any remembrance of it, of any discussion at all.
So, um, when did you actually find out that you were adopted?
Probably somewhere around 6 or 7 years old. I was going through some papers of my parents, and I opened up an envelope, and there were two documents in it. And even at 6 or 7, even though I didn't quite understand the legalese, I essentially realized or recognized that it had something to do with me being adopted. And I think I knew then what adoption meant. And looking back so many years later, I recognized that one of those documents was my adoption decree, and the other one was my amended birth certificate, which essentially put their names in as my parents. But I sort of looked at those pieces of paper and digested them as best a child of 6 or 7 could, and I put them back in the envelope, and I never addressed them again.
So
But
it didn't really phase you that much.
no, Charlene,
That's
it really didn't, and I've heard the people say, "Oh, you must have been in the fog." And I don't think so. I think I was living a life where those people who had adopted me, in my heart were my parents. I went on identifying with them as my parents through my adulthood. And I didn't really start searching for the identity of my birth mother until I was just about 69 years old.
curiosity was one of the things that pushed Ed to start looking into his first parents, but it didn't kick in until later in Ed's life. A number of circumstances came together to provide enough motivation to start searching in earnest.
So this had nothing to do, or the delay had nothing to do with not wanting to hurt my adoptive parents' feelings. My father had passed away in the 1970s, my mother in the 1980s. So I didn't begin my search until 30 years later. And there were a couple of triggers that just sort of told me, finding out who that woman was would be an interesting journey, and wouldn't it be neat to know? I didn't have a compelling need to know, but I thought it would be, yeah, it would be interesting. And I embarked on a journey that took me to some very unexpected results.
Right. So is based on curiosity and not like negative emotions. It's just more about I wonder.
Yeah, I've told people often that it almost seemed like it was an annual event. I would sit and think, gee, I wonder who would give me up, who would give up their child. And I'd ponder it a couple of minutes, I'd shrug my shoulders and go on. And the next year I kind of repeated the same thing. But I really didn't have any driving need to know. Uh, but probably somewhere around what the mid 20 teens, with all the advertising for recreational DNA and ancestry.com and the TV shows that were on at the time, I started thinking, okay, well, now that there are tools out there that might facilitate the journey and the looking. And coincidentally with that, I'd been reading a book by an author by the name of Daniel Mendelsohn, and he had lost six distant relatives in the Holocaust, and he wanted to know what happened to them. And in the big picture, he knew exactly what happened to them. He knew they had been part of that extermination, but he wanted to know precisely the details of each and every one of them. And he was a well-known author. He got a big advance, I assume, and traveled around the world twice over a period of 4 years, searching out people who had known them and came from the same place that they did, until he literally could get to that last person, stand in a given place, and be comfortable with himself that that's where this person had perished. And the book just fascinated me. It was as much a detective story as it was a genealogical story. And so I had that in my head as well. And I'm thinking, well, if he could go back so many years to such a foreign place, I should be able to do something like that with limited resources, but plenty of time. And that triggered me as well.
So tell me, how did this begin? So annually you would come up and say, I wonder. And then
Yeah.
at some point you did a little more.
Well, in 2017, my wife and I were up in New Jersey, and her parents, over the previous 6 to 8 months, both of them had died. They had arrived down here from New Jersey in compromised health. Her mom passed away first, and 6 months later, her father. And we were up there to inter his remains in a cemetery up in New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
And nearby, there was another cemetery, a Russian Orthodox cemetery, which is where the family of my adoptive mother, pretty much in their entirety, was interred. And having the time and being there and thinking we may never get back here again, we went to visit, and we sort of went grave to grave to grave. And I remembered, aunts and uncles and cousins of my mother. And we were then standing over the grave of my adoptive mother's parents, so my adoptive grandparents. And it just struck me at that time, wouldn't it be interesting to look deeper into their background? Their background was not dissimilar from Daniel Mendelsohn's, who had written The Lost. And I said, well, when we get back, I'm going to start investigating. And we got back a couple of days later. I went to our local library. I got onto ancestry.com there, and I had their names, and I started putting their names in and was quickly rewarded with information. And they were like so many immigrants in the turn of the century, the 1890s into the 1900s. They started off on the Lower East Side in Manhattan, and then they moved uptown, and they moved farther uptown as their situation improved, and ultimately bought a pretty good sized piece of property out on Long Island in New York. And I was sitting there thinking, okay, if it's this easy to find their information, I still have those pieces of paper that my mother had saved. I had the adoption decree, and I remembered there were four signatures on that piece of paper, and two of them were my parents, my adoptive parents. One was their attorney. I knew instinctively that other one had to be my mother. So I retrieved that. I got the name. I went back to the library. I typed it in, and that's when the journey truly began.
For you, with the documents were really important, an important piece
They were
of,
terribly important,
right.
compared to what most people start their searches with.
Mhm.
I had a tremendous advantage.
What did you start finding out then about this woman?
Well, I put in her name and got a page of results back, different, census documents, things like that. And I went down the page and I looked and I found the document that was dated closest to my birth. I was born in May of 1948. I found a document dated March of 1949. And oddly, it was a travel visa application from Miami to Rio de Janeiro. So I clicked on it and it had all of her information. It turned out that given its date, I learned that she was 23 when I was born. So she was not a high school girl.
Mhm.
I learned that she had grown up probably not more than 10 or 15 minutes from where I grew up via a city bus ride. And the other piece that was out there, well, there were two pieces. One is it listed her occupation and it said she was an artista, which is kind of a broad title. So I was trying to think of, what would an artist going from Miami to Rio be doing? But then the big piece was there was a facing page and it was my mother's picture.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
yeah, with all of there have been many surprises and many things that have kind of uh, made me, gasp a little bit during this search. That was the biggest one. It remains the biggest one, to be looking at this screen, having a face looking back at me and thinking that was my mother 10 months after I was born.
Oh, wow. So what were you feeling in that moment when you're seeing that?
I don't know other than surprise and other than looking and saying, okay, do I look like her? Does she look like me? I don't think there was a any tremendous feeling. It was just like, okay, so this is the person. And I actually, Ancestry will let you take those kinds of documents and email them. So I emailed it back home and I got in the car and hustled back home and pulled it up on my laptop and I went and I got my wife and I said, would you like to see my mother's picture? And she and my adoptive mother were very close. And she said, we've got your mother's pictures all over the house here. I said, no, not this mother. And, and her first reaction was, well, you look just like her. And, I still don't see it, but there's a very, very strong resemblance to our son. So,
Oh,
so
wow.
there's definitely a connection there.
Oh, that's wonderful. So what else were you finding out about her?
Well, I was sitting there then pondering, I I went to Google and I put in her name and I said artiste or artist and got nothing back. The next day I hustled right back to the library again, got back onto Ancestry. This time I kind of searched a little bit more carefully and I found a marriage license for her, which was dated 7 years after my birth. What it listed was both she and her husband as performers.
Hmm.
So this started to narrow it down a little bit. And it also identified her gave her birth name, which was Narowski. That was her family name. It gave his name, Meza. That was her married name. But it also listed the name Norris, Norris. And I learned later that she had assumed a stage name and had pretty much gone through the balance of her life after she had left home as Genevieve Norris. So
Oh.
with performer and with three different names, I started Googling different combinations. And finally, I retrieved an online newspaper which was edited by an antiques dealer in South Carolina. And she told that she had been in an auction in Georgia in 2012 with a partner. And between the two of them, they had purchased a big group of items that they identified as folk art that had been manufactured by Genevieve Naris Meza and Ted Meza, who were both retired ice skaters
Oh,
who had then gone on to a career creating props for the ice shows and theatrical events and commercial use. So now I had performer and I had ice skater. So again, I started Googling combinations and get the next hit, which was a blog by an antiques dealer, another one in Georgia, who apparently had been at the same auction that they had. And this blog had half a dozen pictures of my mother. There were publicity photographs, so she was in costume and with a partner. It had a copy of her middle school diploma.
oh
It
wow.
had a photostat of her first professional contract. The antique dealer basically said, we had no idea who this woman was. We knew nothing about ice skating, but it was a glamorous woman in a glamorous period. So we bought the box of ephemera. So it was cartons of photographs, a scrapbook, some documents. Actually, it turned out there was some artwork that my mother had created in there. So I looked and I said, what are the chances? This is now, she had bought this 5 years before I began my search. I said, she's an antique dealer. She didn't buy it to keep it. She bought it to resell it. But let me see if I can find her and see if she has any of it left. And I found two people by the same name, one on the West Coast and one in Atlanta, Georgia, who identified herself as a person associated with an antiques mall. And I said, that's got to be her. Via Facebook, I believe I sent a message, and she responded actually fairly quickly. And what I messaged was, I'm investigating a possible family relationship. And I think I'm related to the woman whose materials you have. In fairly short order, she got back to me and said, as a matter of fact, I still have all of these materials and I'd love
Oh,
to talk to you about it, but I'm very busy with my grandchildren now. I'll get back to you soon. And yeah, I had no choice at that point but to sit and wait and wait and wait. And it took probably the better part of a week or 10 days. And then I finally got impatient. I wrote a much more detailed email saying the woman whose pictures you put up is the one who placed me for adoption when I was a day old, and I'm really trying to learn more about her. Could you call me? And within 5 minutes, the phone rang, and she was so apologetic. She said, I'm sorry, I just totally forgot. And she said, we still have all of these things. You need to come to Georgia now. which which was which was kind of funny. But a week later, my wife and I were in the car and we were on our way to Georgia. We met with she and her husband in our hotel, and they had this carton, which was just a treasure trove of my mother's things. As I said, her middle school diploma, the first contract she ever signed. At the very, very bottom of the carton was a news clipping from when she had performed as a 16-year-old with some of her friends at a rally to raise money for war bonds for 1942. In the ultimate kindness and generosity, she and her husband just pushed the box across the table, said, we've been holding this for you. This is all yours. What a treasure that was. And it was representative of everything that's happened on this journey. I've met so many people who have been kind and generous and helpful. And I think for the most part, it's been a reflection on who my mother was, because as I've met the people who have known her, everybody's discussion has been the same, that, she was kind, she was helpful, she was generous, and she was a thoughtful person. And what I ultimately discovered is my mother had left home in New York City in 1943, late 1942, as a matter of fact. She was 17 years old. Tomorrow, by the way, will be her 99th birthday, where she's still alive.
Oh my.
And she left on her own, traveled across the country alone by train to join an ice skating troupe in Vancouver, British Columbia. And that began her professional career. And, and her career slowly ascended. And she was with Ice Follies, which was the first of the big ice skating spectaculars in San Francisco in the summer of 1947. That's where Ice Follies spent their summer, and apparently got involved in a summer romance. This would have taken place in August of 1947 because that's when I was conceived. So it may have been a little bit earlier, but yeah, certainly continued through then. But then in September, Ice Follies left San Francisco, went to Los Angeles, where they did their annual premiere of their tour. Then from there, went to Chicago. And I'm assuming someplace between Los Angeles and Chicago, she realized something was up. It was up to her to find out, you know, was she pregnant? Was there something else happening? And then when she did determine that she was pregnant, to go about managing the pregnancy, reaching the decision to surrender me, and then what to do next. And she essentially did this in secret. She returned to New York City. She had the benefit of, she by that point was fairly much a celebrity in the ice shows, so had resources. And she returned to New York, and only her eldest sister and her sister's husband knew that she was back. Her sister's husband had connections in New York, and put her in touch with a doctor who ran a very small private hospital in New York City. And that's essentially where she managed the pregnancy and where she ultimately gave birth to me. And I remember as a very young child asking my adoptive father, and I think it was strictly out of curiosity, of where was I born? And it was, well, you're born in a hospital in New York. Well, where's the hospital? He said, well, it's in New York, but it's not there anymore. And I said, yeah, not there anymore. I said, hospitals don't just go away. He said, well, it was a very little hospital. It just went away. And it ultimately, that was precisely the truth. But the interesting part was, after high school, or during high school, we moved from a New York City suburb into the middle of Manhattan. And I promise you, if I passed that building that held the hospital 100 times, I passed it 1,000 times. It was 3 blocks from where we lived.
Oh.
And the building is still there. It did close a couple of years after my birth, and the owner went on to another medical enterprise and sold the facility to, I think, to the emergency management system in New York. So it's still there. It's an office building now. It's got retail on the ground floor, but it's a little bit of a landmark for me.
Doing a DNA test helped Ed make family connections to discover more about his father.
I did a DNA test before I started doing my search for my mother, and I did that only to learn about what my ethnicity was. And my adoptive mother was Ukrainian. My adoptive father was Sicilian. Depending on the time of day or how the wind blew, I identified as one or the other most of the time. But yeah, I got to the point again with all the DNA advertising that was out there, saying, well, now I can find out for sure. So I sent in a DNA sample to Ancestry, and I assumed they were in the throes of their holiday rush. So it took quite some time to get my results back. And it was actually after I already knew a good bit about my mother's family tree. And I got back the pie chart, and it clued me in on what my ethnicity was. And then it gave me a list with, oh, I think at that time, 1,000, perhaps 1,100, DNA relatives. And at the top of the list, the first name was identified as a first cousin close relative. And looking at the name, I knew that he was not on my maternal side of the family. I'd pretty well filled out the family tree there. And I said, well, if he's not on the maternal side, he's my first cousin. If he's got an uncle, then I've got a father. So I reached out to him. And again, where so many people say, well, I tried to make contact and nobody ever responded. I got an answer in 10 minutes. And he said, well, this is really exciting. I said, I'd love to help you in any way. So don't be afraid to ask me anything. And he sort of told me his story. He was a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And my next step was I went online and I looked, and lo and behold, he had a public family tree with probably 500 people on it.
Oh, wow.
And so I found him and I looked and I found his father had no siblings, but his mother had a number of sisters and one uncle. So I said again, I said, if this matches my first cousin, and that's the only uncle that out there, he has to be my father. So I kind of, I did some research into him and I found out that he had grown up in the Midwest and then moved down to Texas, and he was an attorney there. So I wrote back to my match again and saying, well, I was just looking at your family tree and this is what I found. So I'm thinking that your Uncle Harris is my father. And my match wrote back again very quickly saying, well, the logic makes total sense. Let me look into that a little bit more for you. Again, 10 minutes later, he wrote and he said, your logic is perfect. He said, but I can tell you two things. He said, your DNA has 25% Ashkenazi Jewish DNA. Uncle Harris has none. I could tell you also that you told me that you were conceived in San Francisco. Uncle Harris never left Texas.
Hmm.
So, no, he's not your father. He must have heard the air go out of me. He said,
Right.
but I have another theory, and I think it's the right one. He said, my father was half Jewish. He said, I am 25% half Jewish. He said, and my father never left San Francisco.
Oh,
I suggest that you and I are half brothers, and my father is your father. And that's
wow.
precisely what worked out.
So how did he feel about that?
He was fine. Yeah, it was very interesting. He told me a good deal about our father, and our father was a bit of a Romeo.
Okay.
I was conceived between the second and third of his five marriages.
Oh,
So I think he just saw a very attractive woman who was several years younger than him, probably swept her off her feet, literally.
mm-hmm.
And I don't believe he ever knew I existed. I really
Wow.
don't, because I don't believe my mother ever looked back. There's no indication that she ever did. He and I met. We traveled out to San Francisco to meet him. And, and at one point he said, I always wanted a brother. This is neat.
All
And,
right.
the other cute thing was as we parted company, he said, do you ever think how many others of us there might be out there? And to date, no one has shown up. But in another sign of generosity, though, he said, my mother and his mother was the third of the five wives. So
Okay.
this would have been after I was conceived. My mother would like to meet you and talk to you.
Oh, wow.
And I knew that she initially had been very concerned with kind of the chronology of all the events. And then she got comfortable and she realized, when I was conceived and when she and my father had met, that, that was not a concern. But we went to visit with her and she was well into her late 90s at that point, but bright and alert and so attractive. And, my half brother, Rich, brought us all in to introduce us. And, so she said hello to my wife and to my son who had traveled with us, and then told Rich, why don't you take them and show them the artwork? She had later married an artist. She said, I want to talk to Edward. We spent a fair amount of time, and all she wanted to do was tell me what she could about my father.
Ed's wife had encouraged him to start learning how to put together a memoir. The things he had discovered about his past seemed like wonderful subject matter for such a project. You decided to go ahead and write this in a book for other
I
people to
did.
read. What brought you to that decision that you wanted to take that project on?
Well, my wife had been I'm retired. And, my wife had been saying, well, you should go and you've done lots of things in life. You should go to a memoir class. And as a matter of fact, or coincidentally, we had the mother of a friend of ours was conducting a monthly memoir session at one of the local libraries. I said, okay, why not? I'll go there. And what I started to record were the efforts I was making to search. And it was just, yeah, it it was kind of like an equivalent of journaling, I suppose, more so than memoir. And it was just like, okay, today I did this, yesterday I did this. And then I was starting to flesh those out. And then as I was discovering more and more about my birth mother, my wife was encouraging me to write more about that. I had or have a very good friend who's an author. And I was telling him, and he was just saying, you really need to write this down, write a book. And that seemed like, yeah, that's an easy thing to say. But, I already had the framework in terms of the memoir pieces about my journey and my search. So then I started writing down what I found as I searched. And it turned into a story about my mother from the time she left her home in 1942 to the time she returned and ultimately surrendered me for adoption, including what she went through in arriving at the decision to relinquish me. So I had in one hand, I had a stack of quote unquote memoir. In the other hand, I had a stack of chapters about her life. And when I started to put it together, I said, well, I'll do book one, I'll do book two, and they'll just naturally flow one to the other. And I sent it to an editor, and the editor said, I'd like to make a suggestion. She said, everything flows very logically to take a chapter of your memoir, a chapter of your mother's life, chapter of the memoir, chapter of her life, and just put it in there like a deck of cards, one card after the other. And that's what we did. And it's perfect that way. Yeah, I'm embarrassed to say I didn't think of it. That's just what she suggested. And, as soon as I heard the suggestion, I knew it was the right thing. So it's a bit of personal discussion and then a piece which essentially, I guess, is creative nonfiction. And it's nonfiction in that in every case, I know where she was, where she was, who she was with, what ultimately happened. The creative pieces, I certainly don't know what they said.
Right,
So
right.
wherever there's dialogue, I created the dialogue, and it's funny that after I was in reunion with actually my maternal half brother and some first cousins. And my first cousins particularly said, boy, you've got Aunt Jenny just perfectly. That's exactly
Oh,
what she sounded like. So,
nice.
she and I came together on the pages.
So it's your story, but it's also your imagining of hers.
Absolutely. I had another friend, who was a real champion of the book. And the first thing he wrote me back after he read it, he said, you became your mother. And I think that maybe vice versa, maybe she came me. I'm not sure what it is, but
Mhm.
we became very close over the pages of that book.
In the end, Ed understands that many adoptees have a much different experience looking into their past than he did. He encourages adoptees to give searching a try if they have any interest in finding out more about their past. So, is there any advice you would give to other adoptees who are considering or curious or? Or maybe it's been a while and they're, well into their own family life like you were. What advice would you give to them if they choose to start looking?
Well, I would say if you're curious, certainly, jump into the pool, get in the deep end. Be persistent. As you noted, I had a huge advantage with with the documents that I possessed. Not everybody, very few, in fact, will have those advantages. More and more states are opening up birth records. So go and pursue whatever documents are out there. But just be persistent. I think DNA is opening lots of doors. And if you're wary of DNA, all I would say is, if you don't do it, somebody else will. And before you're knocking on their door, they'll be knocking on yours. So you might as well take advantage of the science that's out there. On a personal level, I would say just go in with a sense of curiosity and a sense of not having your mind made up, because I
Mhm.
think we discover lots of stories when we search, and they don't all match the ones that you make up in your mind. And I know a lot of adoptees are very, yeah, they have not had positive experiences.
Mhm.
And I really do sympathize with that. And I certainly, for everyone who's had a positive one like me, I know there's at least another on the other side of the coin. But go in with an open mind and listen to the story that you discover, because you may discover more than something that you anticipated or that you assumed. And I think that's important. And you don't want to rule out something good in your life, and you may, against every inclination you have, you may discover something good.
Find out more about Ed, his story, and his book by following the links on my website, Adoption Uncovered. And thank you.